Michelle, welcome to Mind's Worth Meeting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Whitney. It's a pleasure.
So, you're a professor of sociology and African American studies and European studies at Harvard. How did you end up on the academic path that got you here?
I've always been very interested in studying boundaries, the lines that groups draw between one another. I grew up in Canada, basically at the meeting point between the Francophone and the Anglophone world. And I went to study in Paris at an early age. I moved to Palo Alto as a postdoc. I was only 25. So I was always confronted at the time when Silicon Valley was picking up. So I've
Mm-hmm.
really been confronted to many contexts in which there was very intense social change, and I'm a very curious person. I simply wanted to make sense of it. And I'm also very adventurous. So I really like the idea of having a life where you travel and you do research, you're a detective, and you try to understand how different groups understand the world differently. I find it very interesting. That's why.
Wonderful. So, with many global influences in Canada, British, French, American, do you think your upbringing has given you a unique view on the world?
Certainly, I grew up during the peak of the nationalist movement in Quebec, where the dynamic was really for French Canadians to try to transform how they were understood by English Canadians and also to gain autonomy by developing the state as a tool for economic development. So, having grown up in this intense period of social change, I think it parallels, not to overdo the comparison, but what happened with African Americans through the period of, Black is beautiful, Black Power. There's a lot of parallel in that. Growing up in the context of a social movement certainly influence your worldview, and at the confluence of different cultures also. And I've written books that compare France and the US, and the US, Brazil, and Israel. So I'm deeply, very much a comparative cultural sociologist who's interested not in naturalizing or essentializing differences between countries, but really in understanding how people come to understand the world very differently. That's really my specialty.
And when you talk about boundaries, what are the barriers to creating boundaries, or is the goal to reduce the boundaries between these different cultures?
Well, the goal of the book is very much to try to explain how it is possible to reduce stigma. A lot of the research on racism has focused on making people aware of their biases so that they can be less biased when they engage in hiring, for instance. But there's another path toward creating social change, which is what social movements have done, which is really to try to reduce groups that have been deeply stigmatized. For instance, people with HIV/AIDS, this is one group that went from being very stigmatized at the beginning of the AIDS crisis in 1980 to being not stigmatized anymore today, in part because there was a lot of work that was done toward removing the blame and the moral labeling of, a disease that was due to the lifestyle of basically gay men who engage in sexual promiscuity. And the moral blaming is really central to the stigmatization of groups, and that can very well be changed. And there's now in our societies many cultural agents that are oriented toward transforming how groups are defined, but also philanthropies and many organizations that play a central role in scaling up these messages. So it's really about the transformation of how groups are perceived. As a sociologist, I'm interested in narrative change and how it takes place and how it becomes diffused so that it becomes natural. That's how people come to understand the differences between groups. So those boundaries certainly can be changed, and it's happening already all the time. And organizations have a very central role to play in this process.
So the narrative, the storytelling, the messages that we tell about different groups is central to change.
Exactly. And also when I say organizations play a central role in this, if you think about what was the ideal worker even 10, 15 years ago, a man who worked 60 hours a week, and it was an image of the ideal worker that was very masculine. And I think many
Mhm.
organizations have moved toward really having a much more diverse understanding of the workplace, and also making more room for the fact that we're not only producers of work, but we're also human beings with many responsibilities. So there's research showing that organizations that are giving their employees time to bring their kids to the doctor, succeed much
Mhm.
better, in part because they can retain their staff better, and they have workers who are much more fulfilled in the workplace, which generates much more loyalty. So there's a lot of steps that are involved in not only destigmatizing groups, but also creating a workplace that is based on more criteria of evaluation than simply how productive we are as workers. And that's one of the key messages of my new book, Seeing Others, which is that, reducing stigma also involves adopting a wider range of criteria of evaluation, which also include looking at us not only as producers, but also as community members in the workplace, so that we can create a more fulfilling and humane culture for everyone who collaborate together on a daily basis.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the book. The full title is Seeing Others: How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. That just came out in September. So the obvious question is, how does recognition work?
Well, the penultimate chapter of the book is very much inviting the reader to consider what are the steps that we can take. And there's a lot that can be said on this topic, but I focus on three types of change, which are basically going from a single lens through which we evaluate the people that of productivity, toward a multidimensional lens, which includes,
Mhm.
for instance, care work, what I was just mentioning. There's the idea of ordinary universalism, which is really to celebrate all we all share as human beings without denying our differences. Instead of focusing on the hierarchy between groups, think about all the basic needs that all human beings have. And also there's a lot of similarities. There are good and bad people in every ethnic group. That's something that the people I interviewed for the book talk a lot about. And the third approach is the kind of reduction of stigma that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and how this functions often through creating alliance between social movements, but a lot of knowledge workers, legal experts, medical experts, social scientists, journalists, that contribute to transforming the narratives through which groups are viewed. And those groups can be ethno-racial minorities, sexual minorities, but also, frankly, everyone. And that the obligation or the role of transforming these narratives should go not only to people of color who are typically in charge of the EI programs, or toward women, but this is a responsibility that should be shared by all middle level managers. That the creation of a workplace that acknowledges the dignity of all workers is really to the advantage of all employers.
What does that look like on a daily basis for those middle managers? What steps can they take? What can they do right now
Yes.
to bring recognition to the people that they work with?
I think, frankly, the most important thing is to try to put themselves in the shoes of those who have lives very different from them. So, understanding is maybe something that might be viewed as not very concrete, but at the same time, I think it is truly the response. I know in management, people are often looking at what of the five things that you can do today. But I think at the root of it all is really to try to understand people whose lives is very different from their own, and
Mhm.
to really to really understand people whose lives is very different from their own, and to really encourage this shared understanding among different workers, as opposed to people just digging in their heel and really being blind to the challenges that other people experience in their lives.
I I think that's so important. Thinking, my life is very different from some of my colleagues' lives. Some have children, I don't. So,
Yes.
when they have to take a break from work to go to a doctor's appointment or a school event, I know that they have a peace of mind that, the job's not going anywhere. I can take care of the things that are important in my life because I'm always thinking that, we work so that we can live, right?
Exactly.
And if I can't live, it's harder to work. So it's kind of this feedback loop.
Absolutely. And also a workplace where colleagues know that other people have their backs makes a very great difference in quality
Hmm.
of life. And at the end of the day, work is very much about, subjective well being, how people feel in their life. And when we survey people about what they get from their work, it's not only about money, it's very much about the quality of relationship with others. And many workers have experienced a bad workplace, and we know how the stress that comes, the epidemiologists write about the allostatic load, the wear and tear that gets under the skin to create, very important differences in health outcomes. So I think increasingly we're moving toward a workplace that gives much more room to recognition as a dimension. It's not only about diversity and DEI, how many women or people of color you have in a workplace. It's really about
Hmm.
the quality of the relationship that people experience with each other, such as, knowing that your colleague will have your back if you are, in a squeeze and you need to go to the doctor, not only to take care of your children, but also your elderly mother may need you. We all have a mother somewhere. Well, those of us who are lucky enough to still have, parents who are alive, but there's a lot of needs that we all share.
And isn't it also about empathy, having empathy for your
Yes.
coworkers, empathy at work?
Yes, that's crucial. But I think the answer in my book, since I'm not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, I'm
Hmm.
really more concerned with how we create an environment that provides meaning, that is continuous and that is salient. So it's less about the internal work that we do, for instance, by trying to be empathic or, giving, but it's also about the messaging that policies or laws.
Hmm.
For instance, I give in the book the example of same sex marriage, which, as soon as this law was passed, there was a radical decline in the number of LGBTQ high school students who were attempting suicide because the law was, became widely known and was sending to them the message that they matter and they're included in the society and they have access to one of our most sacred institutions. So I think the signaling, even within organizations, about who matters, that the
Hmm.
people who should be celebrated are not always, the the young hot people who just got their degrees from the most famous universities, but also people who've been there for a while and who've done a lot for the community, but maybe in a way that is less startling, and doing a lot of active inclusion through the decision making of who will be celebrated is also crucial. I co-authored a paper that came out a few years ago in a Harvard Business Review that very much makes that point, that who, depending on where the offices are distributed spatially, is also signaling who matters in an organization, and that is something that managers should also take into consideration.
Now, I imagine it takes time for these messages to set in. What does a long term commitment to giving others recognition look like?
Well, I think it's a little bit like, a song in the back of your mind that you have to keep in mind as you're making decisions, not
Mm.
only personal decisions, but also decisions about what will be the pace of work, what are the long-term and short-term objectives, how much, an organization can pursue several objectives at once, what is the human cost of having your employees do too much, so I think it should always be factored in as a dimension of how people decide to lead. I think it's a dimension of leadership that should really be highlighted as well. I'm not the only person saying that, obviously. So it should be always a background consideration.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, is recognition something that we can ask for or demand when we feel that we're being marginalized? How does that work? How does the give and take of recognition work?
Well, if you think of the major social movements of the last few years, for instance, Me Too, okay?
Mhm,
This is a thing that a lot of people had been complaining about for many, many years. But the fact that, it became an important social movement, that it really gained visibility, and that many women, for instance, say, well, in Hollywood, reached a point where they said, we're going to all come out together and make these concerns very public.
mhm,
So that we're not individually penalized for denouncing the injustice. So I think this is very much an example of how it's very important for people to vocalize, but at the same time, take into consideration what are the alliances that are possible, so that you don't come to pay a steep price for
mhm,
doing so. And that's where I think, having conversations among colleagues to try to identify what kind of behavior is reasonable and what kind of behavior is unacceptable. I think there's a kind of collective process that is involved. And, there are studies of, you know, people who denounce harassment in their workplace, that shows that often people who do this end up being penalized and end up not having a resolution that is satisfactory to them. So that's also very much something that has to be factored in when people strategize about this. I think it has to be done, with the input of an ombudsman. I mean, there's
mhm.
often many services that are available to help people think about how to go about this.
But that stresses the importance of not feeling like one person has to do this by themselves. It truly takes a collective effort.
Exactly. And the preparatory steps often involve consulting others and say, this is how I've experienced this. Do you think this makes sense? How have you experienced it? So that, if there are, you know, uh, you know, managers who are toxic, it's by talking and people sharing their common sense about what kind of behavior is unacceptable, that people can really gain clarity about who are the people who are not positive for the workplace, who might create, who might be always negative, or who can be conspirational, which really gets in the way of good teamwork. So, really, to foster a sense that a collective culture that enables everyone is really to everyone's benefit. So, these are aspects that I discuss in the book, because I discuss what organizations can do to enable recognition along these lines.
And with people coming from different backgrounds, having different perspectives, I think finding that single ethical line is difficult. How do
That is,
we kind of reconcile what I think is right with what somebody else thinks is right?
yeah. Well, I think it's important to invest time in developing trust and getting
Mhm,
people to really take the time to get to know each other. That's why at the beginning I talked about the importance of understanding.
mhm,
I think if people start digging in their heels, the situation ends up being viewed as zero sum. Like,
right.
what you gain, I lose. And the book very much makes the argument that dignity is not like a pie. With a pie, if you get a big piece, there's fewer pieces to go around. Whereas dignity is something that everyone can have at the same time. It is not zero sum. It might be connected to who gets what, but often also there's a lot of aspects of dignity that are not zero sum. So I think really emphasizing the fact that dignity, respect, can be widely shared without anyone losing is something that really needs to be emphasize. And since we live in such a materialistic and an individualistic society, people often extrapolate from resources to respect and dignity. Whereas I think, a lot of the recent research, there's a new book titled The Science of Dignity, shows
Mm,
clearly that dignity is just extremely important to people's well being. And money is often less important. If you make a lot of money and don't feel respected at work, your mental health might really be affected by this. So at the end of the day, the goal is really for people to experience well-being. So
right. So bringing it back into the organization, what can executives do to ensure this becomes ingrained in their culture and not just virtue signaling and checking off boxes, but truly making meaningful change within the company?
Well, we know, for instance, in universities, to have the top leaders, the university leaders, be extremely consistent in the kind of messaging that they promote is
Mhm.
absolutely crucial, but also preaching by their action, so that they model to middle level managers and other leaders what kind of behavior is expected. So if, for instance, a top manager appoints only, let's say, women and people of color to be in charge of promoting diversity in the workplace, that sends a message that, okay, these are the people who are in charge of this. Whereas if they make this the responsibility of everyone, the outcomes are much better. And here I'm drawing on the book by Frank Dobbin and Sandra Kalev titled Getting to Diversity. He happens to be my husband, but he was able to document through a really large scale study of various organizations which one have been most able to create a more diverse workplace. And he finds that making the promotion of diversity the responsibility of all mid-level managers is really the best approach.
Well, it sounds like your children are well prepared for this world with those parents.
Well, thank you. We certainly hope so. We'll see. We're giving it our best.
So that makes me think of Gavin Newsom in California. You know,
Yeah.
when a position came up in Congress, he said he was going to fill it with a black woman. There's always pushback to those types of statements and those kinds of moves. What are your thoughts on leaders taking a position like that?
Well, we already know there's a recent book by a sociologist named Adia Wingfield that, well, actually, the book is called Flatlining, and it's a study of the medical field, and it shows how, it's a comparison of physicians, technicians, nurses, and how they experience racism throughout the industry, and how much constantly asking people of color who already suffer from a lot of microaggression on
Mhm.
top of it, that to make it their job to teach everyone else about how to create a diverse workplace might be asking too much. So the
Mhm.
takeaway is really that it's a responsibility that should be shared by absolutely everyone. To say that it's the responsibility of Black people to take care of diversity, I think is deeply unfair. First, because we are living increasingly in a very diverse society, and there's all kinds of ways in which we are diverse, not only ethno-racial identity, but also
Right.
sexuality, even age or region of origin. People with accents. So many American workers have accents. So we all experience various ways in which we feel that we may be marginalized in the workplace. So that should be really increasingly the task that is shared among all workers.
Yes, yes. I hear a lot, from Black women that the feeling is that we have to do everything,
Exactly.
um, and it sharing the load would definitely be a much
Yeah.
much more palatable way to make change.
Yes, and in universities, we've seen the responsibility that women carry on all kinds of committees. And of course, women wanted to be more part of the power structure of universities. But if you
Hmm.
have to do more than your load at the same time as you continue to train students, mentor graduate students, and do research, it just becomes exhausting. And that's what I meant earlier when I talked about the wear and tear of
Hmm.
inequality that gets under your skin, because all this adds up and translates into stress, and then people don't have time to engage in self-care, which is really really crucial if we want to have a lasting and a good work life on the long term, not only on the short term. So
So, as a sociologist, just taking us to the global stage,
yeah.
how do you think the conflicts around the world right now are impacting society at large?
Yeah, well, this interview is, we're recording it at the time when the Israel Palestine conflict is really at its maybe at its apex. We don't know yet, but it's clear that what's happening internationally has a deep impact. What in under reverberates throughout American society. And of course, the challenges of globalization and AI, there's so many aspects of our work life that are, connected directly to the transnational challenges, as well as our relationship with China and with also India. A large, growing proportion of the highly skilled American workforce outside are South Asian. So I think we really have to factor in where people come from and how they experience in the American workplace challenges that come from their place of origin. For instance, we know that in Silicon Valley, many of the workers there have a very traditional gender relationship at home, and yet they come to the high-tech workplace where they have to negotiate relationships with non-South Asian co-workers, women, for instance, or even men. And there's often, clashes that are tied to cultures of origin that reverberate in the workplace in the US. So that's one of many examples that we really need to take into consideration. One of the reasons I like living in Cambridge, well, in Boston actually, is it's a very cosmopolitan place. So
Hmm.
for someone who has an accent, as I do, it's very rare here that I'm being asked, where do you come from? Why do you have an accent? Because so many people do. So there are benefits to living in a cosmopolitan environment that really enables everyone. That means you don't feel every day like you're an outsider, because so many people here are outsiders. So this really has to do also with another factor we need to consider is the transformation of the position of the US in the global order. This is a moment where the hegemony of the US is being very much challenged. And I think that has a lot of implication on, for instance, how non-college educated workers understand their position in society, with all the pushback that we're experiencing with populism, left wing and right wing populism,
Hmm.
which affects the politics in the workplace as well. So, I think that getting people to think about these things, and as they negotiate relationships with people who have different background, is also becoming almost unavoidable, although many people don't like to think about politics in the workplace.
Right.
But we don't live in isolation from what's happening elsewhere. So, and of course, we could go on with the impact of climate change on the growing number of immigrants to America from Latin America. I mean, this is depending on the region where you live, the implications are just enormous. Is that the kind of questions you had in mind as you asked me? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Things are not happening, I think, is a mistake. They need to be addressed. And I think, educating workers also about all these questions is very important, as opposed to people being scared. Many people are extremely scared by all that is happening right now with the changing composition of the American population and the growing immigration and, the fear of scarcity. So,
I I also want to ask you about, making mistakes when meeting new people. So I think a lot of times here in the States, when we come across somebody who is neither black nor white and may or may not have an accent, a first question might be, where are you from? They could be completely American, but the question is, where are you from? What are you, in a sense?
yeah.
Um, what's the better way to get to know somebody without, you know, basing it on these visual factors,
Yeah.
or audio cues?
Yeah.
How can we just be better to new people?
Well, to many people, asking these questions is a little bit like asking, how much money do you make? I mean, it
Mm,
can be
hmm.
very personal, but there's a lot
Correct.
of other things that people can share. That is, if you want less, tied to status hierarchy. For instance, what do you do for your leisure activities?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
what kind of food you like. I mean, there's a lot of ways of starting conversations that may be much less about boundaries of who's in and who's out. And I think zeroing on this is I think always a very good way. And also to go back to your question about phenotype and I mean, there's a growing proportion of Americans who are multiracial as well. So this issue of categorization, is becoming more and more complicated. And we know how salient the question of race and ethnicity is in American society. So it's not
Mhm.
necessarily the most, welcoming way of opening a conversation with people.
Correct.
You know,
Correct.
it's very challenging. I know personally because I have children that, talking about children is often an opener. And people who don't have children also may have other young people in their lives, nieces and nephews, that are very important to them. So I think, it goes back to the question of emphasizing what we all have in common as human beings as a point of entry, I think.
It seems like we've been ingrained to have to categorize people, put them in a certain box immediately upon meeting them.
Yeah.
And what it sounds like you're saying is that's not necessary.
Yeah.
Get to know the human.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
To connect with people. We know also that's how people fall in love, right? By getting
Right.
to know each other and relating. What is the nature of the conversation and how do you feel when you're with someone, as opposed to trying to figure out how you fit in a social hierarchy in relation to them, which is often quite counterproductive, I think.
Right.
But the
Well,
point of the
Michelle,
book is really that this can be fed by the environment, the signaling that is put in place in the environment. It's not, okay, we do this as individual and there's psychological, habits that are factored in, but also, we can really structure our environment in a way that this is much more likely to happen. So that's where the contribution of sociology to this conversation is important, I think.
well, you're definitely shedding a light on the fact that making these changes is completely within our control. We
Yeah.
just have to be conscious of the biases that we come to the table with, have
Hmm.
empathy for other people, put ourselves in other people's shoes so that we can see others better.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not only the question of biases, it's also to contribute to the reduction of stigma so that,
Hmm.
it's the structuring of the environment where we can make a difference. And it's happening and it can happen more. And, the argument that we're all wired to do X, I'm very skeptical about it because there always been groups where the group boundaries were more fluid. To say that it's human nature, I think, is not very useful because human nature
Mm,
is highly flexible, and also there have been times in history where groups didn't have conflicts, and we're very multidimensional as creatures, if you will, and
right.
much of it depends on the environment in which we live. So
So the old adage, boys will be boys, it doesn't fly.
forget it. My father is certainly not like my brothers.
Right, right, right.
So, yeah.
Well, Michelle, we like to do a quick lightning round at the end of our interviews. So, three questions. Give us the first answer that comes to mind. Ready?
Yes.
Okay. What mentor or figure has had the most impact on your life?
Whoa. I was a graduate student in Paris in the late 70s, and my mentor was not exactly my mentors. One person who had a great influence on me is a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, because he really transformed how sociology was being done at the time. I was exceptionally lucky to be there at that time. And I've built a lot of my research agenda as a criticism of his work, but it has very much stayed with me all along. And it has a very inspired vision of what research could be about. So I'm very committed to the kind of work that I've chosen to do. I think it's enormously important, thanks to the examples I had when I was a
Hmm.
student.
What would you say is the difference between how sociology was studied before you started studying and how you do it now?
Well, I'm very convinced of the difference that we can make with the knowledge that we produce, that, knowledge is crucial to the exercise of power, that the expertise makes a huge difference to how we make decision. I mean, that's always been central to the work of all knowledge workers. It's not before and after, it's always been true. I think I'm very lucky because we now are in a moment where knowledge is enormously developed, and I feel that I'm working in a field that is still very much in movement. There's just a lot
Mhm.
of innovation. So I don't feel stuck. I don't feel that I have to be very instrumental to figure out what hoop should I jump in order to do well as an academic. I feel it's an open field, and it's
Mhm.
a very exciting time to do the kind of work I do.
Wonderful. Okay, next question. If you had to pick one thing that you most hope to see for our future, what would it be?
I think for a lot of Gen Zs whom I studied in my book, Seeing Others, many of them have gained a lot of distance toward the American dream, in part because of climate change. They're not sure if we're all going to be alive again in 40 years from now. And for them, the pursuit of consumption, finding happiness in consumption, is just that much of a motivation for them. And they have really been looking for alternative sources of hope. So, what
Mhm.
I show in my book is that for them, inclusion has come to replace the American dream for many. And for them, it means, living authentically and bringing their best self to their work on a daily basis. So, I would say my own hope is for them to really, especially for young people who've gone through, started college during COVID, they've had a terrible
Tough
time.
time.
And I
Yeah,
wish for them to be able to continue to maintain a sense of hope and to find, a path. And a lot of this is done through narratives for that may give them examples of what the life ahead could be, so that they don't feel that it's hopeless, that, it's there's nowhere for them to go. And I think it is happening. I see a lot of reasons to be very optimistic about how young people are now fighting for a lot of things that are important for them.
that's really good to hear. And last question. What's your favorite app on your phone?
My favorite app on my phone. I think it's my family group chat,
Oh,
which we call Rocking Fam, and it's my texting. But we have a family group, and we exchange articles we read or jokes or memes. So that I find entertaining throughout my day. I'm always happy to see messages that come up there. So I'm not a huge social media person. Of course, with the diffusion of the book, I've become much more active on LinkedIn and other things. But I would say I'm very attuned to how this like the like culture and the thumbs up and thumb down culture is not very good for us. So I'm trying to keep it a little bit at bay.
well done. Same here. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us. Where can we find you on social media?
Well,
The bit of social media that you do, where can we find you?
it's basically I do X, formerly Twitter,
Yep.
and I'm M Lamont 6, I believe. And then I also do LinkedIn, and I have Facebook, but this is more for private stuff. So yes, I think following that, and also my website is michellelamont.org. So there, the listeners can see the new articles that are coming on my work and the various things I contribute to various outlets. So that would be the way to find what I have to say.
And folks can also find you on the Stern Strategy Group Speakers and Advisors website. One of our favorite speakers. We're really excited to have this conversation today. And I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Whitney. I'm very glad that we had a chance to chat.